So what comes to mind about this once I agreed to do this is
Agreed, but also it was not,
taunted,
I didn't,
taunted.
I've been
Uh,
chasing you down for months.
yeah, taunting you. You should to do this, but then boarding
You
it.
caught the mail truck.
Yeah, caught the mail is something that my brother told me when I was asked him to introduce me to my wife. And his first comment was, "Oh my God, nothing good can come from this."
Hey everybody, it's Matthew. This is just a bonus episode. I this is maybe going to be this episode may appeal only to a certain portion of the audience. My guest for this episode is a figure who is notorious on this podcast, mentioned in well nigh every episode, but never before featured. If you have ever wondered what kind of asshole raises a guy like Matthew Buckley Smith, then you're about to find out. My guest is Jimmy Smith, my father. I'm not sure how else to introduce him. We do have a real topic. In addition to his gripes about Brian and the podcast and all of the things I've gotten wrong about him over the years, just about years at this point, we talked about a book by Alinda Baton called The Architecture of Happiness. We talked broadly about architecture as well as about poetry. My dad has actually read a handful of books in his time. I think it's a great conversation. If, like my wife, you retreat as quickly as possible from the boozy late night Smith men downstairs conversations during Christmas break, then maybe this one isn't for you. But I'm releasing the first half of it on the main feed and the second half on the secret show. And now here is James Haverty Smith, Mr. SLEERICKETS Sr., the master builder himself.
Brian when he gets something, he's like a really sweet pit bull, but then something triggers him and he just latches on and you can't shake him off of something. He,
my
but
favorite
I know
note in
it's
your
all, it's,
yeah
but it's but he does it, I'm sure, with a smile, but
yeah.
ouch.
My favorite
You
note
know,
in your long list of semi-coherent typed on the go notes on the show, my favorite one just says Brian Plattsmouth. That's the whole note. I don't even know what
that
it's
was a,
referring to. You sent me this sort of awesome list of notes on episodes, and I was going through it, extracting maybe 1 in 10 until I realized I'd filled up many pages with just my extracts, and I was still only
oh my God.
like a fifth of the way through the whole list. So I skipped a bunch in the middle, but I took some from the end as well. But there was a note you made about being, because I've talked a few times on here about being embarrassed to be a poet, and you had a note about being embarrassed to be an architect around other architects versus around strangers. And then you also had a note on being, when you were briefly on Matchbook, which I guess is like a dating site when you were single for a little bit. Was that what
Yeah,
Matchbook was? I assume.
I think so. Match
Or Match.com.
book dot yeah, match.com or
Sure.
matchbook. Yeah.
Matchbook is a good name for it. I don't know if that's a real site, but it's a good name
matchbook
for a site.
match.com, I think, but matchbook is kind of maybe a more appropriate
Kind of
for you.
trademark that. Yeah.
No, yeah. At the time, no one, everyone thinks being an architect, it's a cool word, it's
Right.
a
Yeah.
really cool word that means master builder, I think, in Greek,
Mm-hmm.
or is where it comes from. But it no one knows what an architect does. They sort of don't really build buildings. They don't have they're not developers. A lot of times they're presented in a movie as the evil developer who is an
Right.
architect, but he's not an architect. We walk around with a roll of drawings, and we have a cool table and usually some cool looking models hanging around. But no one knows what we do. We actually don't know
Except
what
that they're
we
really
do.
rich. Architects are really rich is the only thing you know
Yeah,
from
which
movies.
we're
Yeah.
not, which we're not. It's just a cool profession. So it was the number one profession uh, uh, within match match.com uh, uh,
Like
for
the
women.
most desirable.
The most desirable, excuse me, the most desirable profession was being an architect. Little do people know, because you're quote making a lot of money.
Right.
No one,
Doctor, lawyer,
but you're kind of
architect. Yeah.
artsy. Yeah, but you're a little more artsy than
Yeah. Yeah.
a lawyer or a doctor. You make a whole lot less money, but you make a decent living, and people think you kind of change the world. You're like Howard Rourke on Fountainhead. You can, if you don't like a building, you blow it up.
Ray Bradbury has a story about that too. How it's true. It's actually it's a cabal of architects who run the world, and they coordinate all the major world disasters so they can build new buildings.
Well, and the book, Alain seems to have that misconception too. You read his last chapter, it's like, well, wait a minute, uh, but we also have a tradition. There are a couple of famous architects that really have not helped the profession in terms of trying to overcome the idea that we're all basically kind of assholes, which we may be. But I mean, like Frank Lloyd Wright is notorious for his comments. He made some amazingly arrogant comments. Le Corbusier, he was just disparaging left, right, and sideways. I mean, Frank
Yeah.
Lloyd Wright, building would leak, and this was the Johnson Wax building by Johnson. Mr. Johnson goes to Mr. Wright and goes, well, we really like the building, but the roof leaks like incessantly, and the secretary's desk have three legs, and on wheels, and they're falling over all the time. And he just said, well, teach your secretaries to learn how to sit properly, and no architect's worth his salt if he designs a roof that doesn't leak. So just put some buckets out.
Your problem is how
So
you're inhabiting my building. I was curious because I think you mentioned it in the notes, because these are like notes you've made sort of like while walking out with the dog, like on your phone. So some of them are sort of fragmented or cryptic, but it seemed like you had a note about being like embarrassment about being an architect when you're around other architects versus being around strangers versus and then this weird phenomenon on with online dating. But I was curious if that, because I know I had talked about being embarrassed as a poet around non-poets, and it sounded like for you it was almost like for you it was almost the opposite. Like around other architects there was a different expectation that it was more a burdensome than around strangers, where it could just seem cool and distant.
yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think it's less of an embarrassment around people who know nothing about what we do, because it just sounds cool.
Yeah.
And George Costanza wanted to be a marine biologist or an architect when he would lie about both when he was trying to impress a young lady that he was wanting to get to know better.
It's because they sound like
Yeah,
everybody knows they're real, they're legitimate, but also
yes,
nobody knows anything about them, and so they just
yeah,
sort of sound like cool,
they
distant. Yeah.
it sounds cool. It's a cool sounding word. We have something to do with we can kind of draw. We're supposed to be kind of creative. We get a license. We're registered. There are movies made. Movies love TV series. Movies love to have architects without the architects ever doing architecture. You
Mhm.
see police movies or law movies. The lawyers are working all the time. The policemen are, you
Yeah.
know, all the time. Architects are talking to their horses, like Mr. Ed,
Or they
or
throw a
they're
tantrum. They have a model and then they flip over a table and throw huge. It's
yeah,
Kevin
oh
Kevin
yeah,
Klein wearing a sexy sweater and flipping over a table and saying, "I quit."
that's right. Or the closest one was oh god, I'm having a Rick Perry moment. Jungle Fever was the
Oh, I haven't seen
movie.
that one.
Yeah, and he's an architect, a young black architect, and he's very successful. but he's, works for an architect, works for and he doesn't have the respect. And when he quits, he walks by and he sees all these models, and he gets no credit for them, but he walks out, he goes, mine, 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 mine. He did them all. He's that's not totally true either. But yeah, architects do. They also Towering Inferno. They're supposed to know the entire electrical system on each panel and why the red wire was crossed with the green. You're supposed to know all that. I would get lost. I get lost.
You could defuse a bomb, is what you're saying. You would be good on.
Oh yeah. That. Oh yeah. No, I've designed buildings and I get lost in them. I don't know where I am. So I don't even know where the exit signs are. So
that's the ring of architects in Dante's Inferno. Is you're lost in buildings you designed.
One of my favorite buildings ever that was never built was it was called the Danteum by Taragni. So he was commissioned to do this basically a museum to honor Dante, but the way he did it, the idea of the design is that you're actually going through the Divine Comedy. So he has this large open square where you open up and you don't know where you are, and then you pass through 100 columns that are the dark wood, and then you pass into the Inferno, which is steps down, and eventually you work your way up on top of where the forest was, and it's a whole series of glass columns. So it would have been a cool project in Rome. It was the catch is that he was commissioned by Mussolini.
Right.
So
but there's like a tradition of like
project.
Great morally compromised architects, like that's Speer as well, and increasingly the way people talk about Thomas Jefferson, who was brilliant architect and obviously deeply morally compromised.
Yeah, that's probably true of all of us, I guess. To some degree, some more than others, but yeah. Architecture, is some of the great works of architecture were commissioned under despotic rule for the most part.
Oh yeah, like most of them, right? Like
pretty much.
Pyramids,
Yeah, you don't want the more distance there's placed between art, buildings, whatever, and more time between that, right. the less offensive you are, or less offended by it.
But we don't taste it as much when it's the Medici.
Yeah. So it's it's interesting, the word architecture, and it's used a lot out of context or away from architecture itself. Because people use the word everyone uses the word to describe writing bills, the architect of the bill. Mm-hmm. You got the sanitary architect.
I had a friend in who worked in tech who was a user experience architect.
Actually, the computer industry has absconded the word.
Yeah.
If you look up,
it's a verb now too.
To architect, there's a guy that wrote a book about that. Oh my God! But architecture deals with computers. If you Google architecture, that's one of the first things that comes up.
You sent me an article that looked like it was a bunch of poems. At first, I thought it was poems about architecture, and then I realized it was poems by architects.
Oh, they're poems by architects.
Yeah.
Oh my God!
I read a handful of them. It wasn't great. Some of them were better than others, but it wasn't. I mean, honestly, it wasn't that much different than the funnier one. The better ones were the ones that were just sort of funny, where it was like the voice of a room making complaints. But but a lot of them were just like typical, just like a series of abstractions and feelings. It's like, all right, that's fine.
That's wonderful. So now you can. Why don't you design some houses?
Right. That was the other thing that drove me crazy. It's like I'm not an architect. Like the article said, like, some even go so far as to say architecture can be learned from poems. It's like, what does that mean?
Yeah, of course it can.
Is that like is like ancient Greece, where your Homer is your textbook for all fields, all practices?
Well, I recommended that book, The Architecture of Happiness, and we can touch on it.
Yeah.
But architecture is looking for inspiration everywhere. And one of the things on one of your podcasts, you talked about how we would have stupid things at our desk. One of my
little
partners
toys
had
and
toys and
models
stuff
and
like
things,
that.
puzzles.
Mainly, I had those toys because y'all would come
because we
by.
would come visit. Yeah.
Yeah,
But there were other, like a lot of other desks had little, maybe they were for their
oh
kids
yeah,
too,
oh yeah, no, that was one of my former colleagues who he got inspiration that way. But we have all that stuff. We're surrounding ourselves because we're desperate for some sort of inspiration. And so we have drawings, we pin up all kinds of stuff just to try to give us some idea and to come up with some sort of story, an idea basically for architecture. Because our architecture starts with an idea. And that's the difference, I think, like this guy, Lou Kahn, who I was trying to think, what is an architect who really was kind of poetic in how he approached architecture? And he's one amongst
as well
architects.
as how he approached marriage. But yeah.
Oh yeah, he was creative. He had a secret. Actually, that's not that uncommon anyway, is it? Apparently, you hear about all these cases.
I guess so.
At least on Netflix, there are all kinds of shows that people have a secret, or they're murdering, or they're murdering their spouses, one or the other.
But yeah, Louis Kahn,
Luke Kahn was, he would have ways that. So I was trying to think, rather than going to a philosopher to define architecture, I thought I'd look him up and see what he said. And he says some interesting things. He said, so we're looking for inspiration. So poems are definitely right there for inspiration. I mean, we're not going to. It's. I guess you could design a building that's made out of letters or something, but that would be pretty stupid. But
but I mean, like the Divine Comedy is like, it's almost more architecture than poetry in some respects.
Exactly.
I mean, it's because it's static. There's no real change. It's like you just see this enormous structure revealed over the course of three.
Books. And in fact, the Dante on that building is basically modeled after the structure of the Divine Comedy. It's the way the masonry is stacked up recalls a terza rima. Is that how you say that?
Yeah, terza rima. Yeah.
The spaces, the size of them, it's based on the proportional systems that have been attributed to the Divine Comedy. So and yet it's actually the rooms that work your way through it. It's an outdoor kind of. It actually would have been a very cool thing. There've been some people that have done computer modelings of it. It is tainted by its association with the final space being a tribute to Il Duce. So not a good idea. And it's also a prime piece of real estate in Rome where it was going to probably some insignificant homes or something were going to be destroyed to build this. Anyway, poetry is a great influence for architecture. We're looking for something, and architecture is a good influence. I mean, it's an inspiration for poetry, right? I mean,
I mean,
Ozymandias and.
No, I mean, and even the last chapter of Marcia's book, which I didn't have time to. I would have to take photos of it all to send to you. But the last chapter of his book is basically he takes the whole vocation of writing and he tells a parable where it's a giant hotel. So it's all these sort of mixed, muddled styles and ages, and it's this sort of labyrinth where it looks like one thing from the outside, but you go inside and you keep going through doors and never reach the end. So it's as an architectural image, it's a little bit foggy, but it's a cool parable, and I think it gets at something probably true about writing.
Well, I'd have to dig up the quote, which I could find somewhere, but what Kahn says is that architecture starts with something that's unmeasurable. He talks about it's unmeasurable, but eventually you have to figure out what it is. So it becomes measurable. You have to put it down on paper and figure out how to build it. But at the end, it returns to being something that's unmeasurable in the sense that it becomes sublime, or it strives to be something that's sublime. Well, here's I'll quote what he says. He says, "A great building, in my opinion, must begin with the unmeasurable, must go through the measurable means when it is being designed, and then the end must be unmeasurable." He says the only way you can build is to get a building into being is through the measurable. You must follow the laws of nature and all. But in the end, when the building becomes part of living, it evokes unmeasurable qualities, and the spirit of its existence takes over.
No, that
He
seems
talks about that
yeah,
architecture is
very true.
really has an existence. He says it has an existence, but it has no presence. Only a work of architecture has presence, and a work of architecture is presented as an he. This is his. He does get a little poetic. He says a work of architecture is presented as an offering to architecture. So he uses a lot of
Yeah, yeah.
metaphor. He almost sounds like a Zen master. So
Yeah,
he
yeah.
crossed
Well, it's
between
like
a
the
native.
like I was gonna say it sounds like the inverse of like Buddhist enlightenment, where you start with ordinary life and then you achieve enlightenment and then you return to ordinary life, and this is sort of the inverse of that. You start with the transcendent, and then you have to go back to earth to build it, and then it guides you back to the transcendent.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah, but he
cleaning
also
your
sounds a little
bowl,
bit like, oh yeah, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
you're cleaning your bowl is becomes transcendent. The
Yeah.
ordinary becomes extraordinary in a way.
Well, I was just going to say the way he's talking about a work of architecture becomes an offering to architecture sounds like a lot of, I mean, I always feel a little bit ambivalent about this, but there are a lot of poets who, famously, I feel like Robert Frost may be one of the more prominent examples, or one of the examples who's like a prominent poet I still like, who seem to, at some level, believe that all poetry was about poetry. That poetry was sort of fundamentally always describing itself, explaining itself. And I think I I always feel a little bit like, well, but aren't we moved to write poetry for other reasons? Like, don't we have other things that make us feel, strongly and drive us to want to express that or convey that? But there is a lot of writing about poetry is basically that like poetry is always sort of recursive. It's always all you can really ever do is do poetry for poetry, but it's like FUBU, poetry for us, by us, about us.
Well, I mean, when you read Khan, he doesn't specifically say, talk about the divine, but he talks about it very poetically.
Yeah. Well,
you
an
know.
offering. Yeah.
And there's a quote here where at the beginning of the book, Silence and Light, he says, all material in nature, the mountains, the streams, and the air, and we are made of light. And he has capital L for light, which has been spent in this crumpled mass called material cast a shadow, and the shadow belongs to light. So he's very, it's very Zen sort of. It
Yeah.
sounds like it could be kind of a
I was going to say, I feel
native
like the sci-fi fans call that hand wavium.
hand waving
They're
them.
like,
Yeah,
how does this spaceship manage to travel faster than light? We operate on hand wavium. I
yeah,
think like
yeah.
that feels a little bit like that to me, but maybe I'm just not,
Well,
not
no, and
tuned in.
he one of his yeah, one of his quotes was, "I always ask the brick what it wants to be." He attributed,
Right.
but like
There was
almost like
like,
a
didn't, was it
mystic.
Michelangelo who had something about like finding the sculpture in the marble?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, someone I knew, one of my colleagues, he passed away recently, but he studied under Lou Kahn at UPenn, and he, I mean, at a time when he was a phenomenon, I mean, he was dead by the time I went to architecture school, but he said that he was he had a mirthful side.
Hmm.
So, it's almost like we think the mystics, you know, were these very serious people. I mean, they're serious, but there's a little bit of tongue in cheek. I
Yeah,
suspect
yeah.
that, Jesus, when he's playing in the sand, he's kind of messing with us a little bit.
Oh,
He's kind
he's
of,
so funny.
yeah, he's funny. People don't think of him that way. I
No,
mean, I think,
like, it's so witty. His sayings are like great. like that's the thing is like whatever else you want to say about him, like whoever came up with these lines was genius. They're just great
Yeah,
one-liners, you know.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I kind of think and it's probably true of the the Dalai Lamas and all.
Yeah,
They from what you gather, they had a they're grounded. They have a
yeah,
sense
yeah.
of the absurd.
My
They can.
my nemesis, I have to give him credit. Philip Metris. Philip Metris is not my nemesis, but he in an email had told me that I think his father or someone he knew had been friends with Viktor Frankl, and apparently he loved IHOP. He always wanted to go eat at IHOP. It was the like it's hard to get mad at a guy who loves IHOP. Even if I prefer Waffle House.
Well, okay. Well, that might explain your comments about Viktor
That's true.
Frankl.
I'm
That
not a poetry chauvinist, but I'm a Waffle House chauvinist. So yeah,
you're
that's
so
the
you're really just you're a pancake snob,
right.
or,
Yeah,
or waffle snob.
yeah,
You like
exactly.
the
It's like
so
the
that
yeah.
was the whole issue. You didn't like his sense of abundance.
Mhm.
Uh,
It's too many
yeah.
syrup flavors. Come on, this is absurd. This is
Okay.
decadence.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, architecture should be poetic in some way. But you're kind of a guy with is a quote, I guess, a formal poet who likes
That's the
the
term that is
architecture.
just unavoidable. I love structure. I love structure and convention because I just love, I think there's a lot of mileage to get out of it before you abandon it. I mean,
So
it's great
so
to
you
innovate, but I also just love using conventional structures.
well, I mean, architecture is naturally very structural, but and I like within the profession the structural side of it. I mean,
Yeah.
I like to express or see the rhythm and the regularity in buildings. I had trouble just doing just the real soft amorphous shaped forms that were big, for the last 20 years. You
Was it
still see a lot of it.
Calatrava or is it Gary? And who's the other? Not Gary.
Frank
There was a
Gehry, yeah.
yeah Gary because he did the Spiral
Bill,
Museum right in New
no,
York.
Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright did that.
No, isn't the? Am I thinking of the what? I'm thinking of it. Maybe it's the person who paid for it. I'm thinking of.
No, you're thinking of the Guggenheim
That's
in
the Google. Yeah,
Bilbao,
that's sorry. That's what I'm thinking of. Yeah,
and,
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
and
Never mind.
there's a
Did Frank Lloyd
Guggenheim
Wright
in
do
New
that?
York.
The Spiral Museum in
Yeah,
New York. I didn't know he
yeah.
did
He
that.
kind of yeah. I mean, he he moved around, did different stuff. He would do very angular, and about the same time he was doing that, he had either right before or right after. I think it was right after he did the Guggenheim after he did, which is in New York, after he did uh, Falling Water, which
Okay,
is
yeah,
a
which is
series
like all
of
planes.
planes and slabs. It's a house,
Yeah,
so maybe one of the coolest houses
yeah. But I don't. Yeah, I don't
uh,
think of that as having a lot of
ever.
curves in it.
Very few. He
Yeah.
had there virtually none. Although he does kind of soften the edges of some of the planes, so to have a kind of a rolled top edge. But yeah, no, it's very very
Yeah.
angular. He wanted it to feel like the slabs, coming, like a waterfall. Why I called it
Yeah, I mean,
kind of
it
falling water.
feels sort of like the angle, the sharp angles you get of rock ledges at a waterfall, and then it also has the kind of the weightless quality at times where stone on glass. But I think of
I
like
mentioned
sorry, go ahead.
no, I mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright earlier, or Frank Lloyd Wright was notorious for being kind of an ass, but
Yeah, is
he
he the
when he
one person who's famous mostly like who's super famous primarily for being an architect? Because there are like
yeah,
historically there are other
yeah.
architects who were famous for but who also were architects. They're like I mean Michelangelo was an architect, Jefferson was an architect, but they tend to be it's the other things that brought them primarily bring them fame today. But Frank Lloyd Wright is like the one name you associate. If there is like the top line name for there's not
Sure.
really anything else that you'd think of him as being.
No, he totally. I mean, his mother decided he was going to be an architect when he was a little boy and gave him what were these things called foible blocks. So I mean, there's some great books and stories about him. I mean, he was
Yeah.
uh, a philanderer. He ran off with one of his clients' wives and crossed the the state border, so he was considered it was considered kidnapping because at that time, and he was on the lam, and he was so obsessed with he had such a big ego that apparently how he got caught is he went into a store and he kept bragging about who he was. You know who I am? He couldn't lay low, and so they said, "Oh, okay, you're wanted." So he was in one of the schools, a place. It was this horrible murder of one of his wives. Actually, that wife he did end up marrying.
There was like it was like a multiple. It wasn't like a fire and an axe murder or something.
Yeah, they burned down Taliesin East. Axe murder. It was one of the employers there and employees there. Yeah, I mean he lived a very amazing life and lived very long. He's an interesting character, but most of us are much more boring. We don't talk to horses. We don't run off with people's wives and stuff like that too often. We're pretty domestic.
But yeah, that you're saying that for you, because that is another one of the kind of periodic interests on the show, is this idea of what was fashionable when you were coming up, and to what degree are you influenced by that, or do you rebel against that? It sounds like for you, some of I think of like the Corbusier or Calatrava, or even your person Hadid, as being those kind of curvy organic shapes. But was this sort of what was in vogue when you were coming up?
When I was coming up, Frank Lloyd Wright in the architectural world was not, because he's so known.
Right.
That he was not that cool, but everyone you could not appreciate his work. But the curvy stuff was not big when I was coming up. We were, when I was in school, we were reacting to classic modernism. What was in vogue we were right in the heyday of postmodernism. Postmodernism really, if anything, as much began with architecture as it did with philosophy. But we would read the structuralists. We read de Saussure, Claude Lévi-Strauss. I never could understand any of it. It was like totally obtuse, but we're supposed to try to understand the idea of representation and self-referential, a lot of self-referential stuff. I don't know how that equates into poetry, but structuralism is something. The structuralists, or semiotics.
There's certainly, I mean, the literary arm of that, I think primarily of Derrida, and then some of the people who followed after him. I mean, it was a lot of that stuff that was why I moved away from proper, English departments, because I felt pretty alienated by that. But then the aftershocks of that when I was in school were, I guess it felt a lot like that's kind of some postmodern architecture, where there was a lot of kind of allusion, but it was in a very light tone, with a lot of kind of mocking the idea that you would be doing a poem, while at the same time having a kind of the idea that it was by disrupting the expected forms, you were not only sort of making a brand for yourself, but you were doing a sort of justice, that this was important. It was important that we kind of shake up and tear down old structures. And I just found most of that stuff to be, a lot of it felt to me like language jokes that you would make while messing around with your writer friends at a bar, but that would be the finished work for a lot of the stuff, would just be like a lot of sort of language jokes.
When we were in school, there was actually a resurgence of revisiting traditional architecture, but in a way that was with a lot of the qualities you described, kind of tongue in cheek. It was very. We looked at the Mannerists, in architectural world. I don't know in the relationship or the association in writing, but you had I don't know. You had classicists. You had, the Renaissance, and then you had the High Renaissance, which was classical architecture. They're bringing Rome back, but kind of revisited in a slightly different way. Palladio and Brunelleschi and those guys. And Michelangelo was actually the beginning of Mannerism, where he would distort the classical orders, and he would kind of play with it. And then you had High Mannerists, which were, turning. You would have for instance, a archway, and the keystone would be slipped, like the arch is getting ready to fall. Lots of sort of in jokes, references, self-reference, referential architecture.
Honestly, that sounds a lot like Pope. That might kind of be the correspondent, Alexander Pope, who was very.
Alexander Pope would have been, probably.
He was extremely formally daft. I mean, a genius, formally speaking, but also was just always. There was a lot of jokes within jokes and lines that enacted the. I mean, he wrote a whole epic poem called the Dunciad that was just like, it was a mockery of an epic that was just a list of all of the bad poets of his time, making fun of all of them. And I mean, but he also would write, like he wrote a mock epic called The Rape of the Lock, where you have.
Oh yeah,
I mean, so he even his sort of slightly more serious poems were often just full of references to their own technique in a kind of a mocking way.
Is
so,
he?
That might be kind of
what period? When did he live?
I should know better than I do. I mean, 18th century, but I can't remember.
18th century. That's about right. That would be later. Michelangelo was
earlier than that.
Yeah, a little, but he was early on. So you would have that.
Okay,
that makes
he died. He was born 1688 and died 1744. Yeah, a little.
So then you're kind of overlapping into the Enlightenment. Alexander Pope. So I thought that was such a weird. I'm really digressing here, but I was in Counterpart, that show Counterpart.
Yeah.
One of the main characters was
this TV series with J.K. Simmons.
Oh yeah, it's so good. Which is also kind of what we're doing here. This is very talking about self-reflective. Father's looking at the son, who's looking at the father, who's
right. I feel like this is like in the Magus, where he thinks he's in the Tempest, but then it turns out he's in Othello. And I feel like we think we're in Counterpart, but it turns out we're actually in Looper.
In Looper, I don't know Looper, which would probably be appropriate.
It's a very schlocky sci-fi action movie where a hitman meets his future self, and it's.
Oh, I have seen that. God,
yeah. It's like a lot of cool ideas that don't totally hold together, but yeah.
Oh yeah, I do. I can't. Who stars in that?
It's Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Bruce Willis.
Oh yeah, Bruce. Yeah, okay.
But we think we're in Counterpart, which is much more dignified, but actually,
you're right.
Actually, it's like a pulp sci-fi movie. Yeah.
Is Looper the one where like he goes into the future and the guy's already bound up and he just shoots him in the head?
Yeah.
And then he realizes it's himself. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That was a pretty weird movie.
Yeah. It was. I mean, again, like it had some great stuff in it. The Paul Dano thing was like totally chilling, but it just sort of didn't. It was. I mean, like a lot of movies, it was like a lot of great ideas doesn't totally hold together. But,
yeah.
But yeah,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
If architects, this is probably true with you guys. You talk about your profession a little bit, or your area of knowledge, like poetry. You sit down and talk about poetry, and after about 15, 20 minutes, you talk about what's on Netflix. What's the latest movie? That would be lunch. That would be our design. We would have these design meetings. They fly us to the different cities, and they give us lectures. We'd have lectures talking about what's going on, blah blah blah. And we were all kind of doodling in our notebooks, and then it'd be like, "Did you see the latest?"
It's like a meeting made up of guys who are always in the back row doodling in their notebooks, but it's the whole meeting is just those guys.
Yeah, it's exactly.
All right, If you would like to hear the second half of this conversation, then go to sleerickets.substack.com and sign up for the secret show, or just put in your email address and I'll give you a week's access for free so you can hear the thrilling conclusion of this conversation with my dad. My guess is you will either already have skipped this episode, or if you are Alice, then you're probably really thrilled to hear more. So just for you, Alice, please enjoy the second half on the Secret Show feed, available very soon, if not already. I'll probably just release it all at once. All right, enough of this shit. I'll see you all soon with a real episode on Wednesday.